So that is the synthesizer patch I'll be showing you how to make in this video. It's a bass patch inspired by the Yamaha CS-80 synthesizer, which was made popular by its use in a lot of different film scores, like the Blade Runner soundtrack, for example. It has this very harmonically rich tone to it, and is great for creating lush pads and really fat sounding bass lines. So inside of Serum, we can go ahead, open things up to its init patch, which is just the blank patch, and then we can start drawing in a waveform. Let's go ahead and draw in that same sort of classic saw waveform that we've done several times throughout this course. So start up in the left-hand corner after turning off the grid values on the right-hand side, and we'll just start here, click on this, kind of drag upwards to the corner, and then do something like this that dips down just before kind of the halfway point, and then just kind of goes over something like this. Even kind of round that out a little bit more. And then we can kind of just tighten things up just a little bit and add in some variation. And then we can go back over this and just smooth everything out. So this always takes a little bit of trial and error because it isn't perfect because we're drawing in everything by hand. But it always gives this kind of an interesting sound. That's why I like to do things this way. All right, so that is the completed waveform. You want to have it looking something like that. And then that sounds like this. So the cool part about this is because we kind of rounded out this section here, it has this hollow sound to it that's kind of reminiscent of a pulse width modulated score waveform, which would be great for this type of sound because it'll give us something that's very lush and very filled out, but it also isn't going to be too fat where it's going to have lots of muddy lower frequencies. So we want to make a few different small adjustments to this, which will be go over to the unison control and just change that to an amount of 5 and bring the detuning down to just about 0.07. Make sure the blend is all the way up so the stereo voices are louder than the voice that's happening in the center. And that so far sounds like this. And then we also want to modulate the phase control like we did with the other patches. So go down to the Chaos 1 control and modulate the phase. And then we'll also be creating some pulse width modulation as well. So go down to pulse width modulation where it says PWM. And that'll give us the option to pulse width modulate our waveform. Usually pulse width modulation is done on square waves. It's not usually done on saw waveforms. So this will be a bit unusual. It's not exactly something you'd have on a vintage synthesizer. But for this specific patch, because we want something that's very, very phasey, this will enable us to achieve that effect without creating all sorts of unusual modulations. So it's an easy way to add a lot more phase and variation to your saw waveforms. So let's go ahead and do that now. So we'll go over to LFO number 1, go to the folder, open up the basic waveforms and load in the sine wave preset. And we could leave all these settings where they're at by default, except for the rate. We just want to bump that up to 16th notes. So it's happening a little bit faster. And then we'll go ahead and modulate the pulse width. And we just want a little bit of this, probably about 12 or so, not too much modulations. That way we just get a little bit of variation at the end of this waveform. So this gives that waveform that sort of interesting wobbling effect. And then we want to go ahead and fatten up this sound quite a bit, but it's not super fat sounding. It doesn't really sound like a bass. So let's go ahead and go over to the sub oscillator. Go ahead and turn that on, drop the octave down to -1, and then go over to the square waveform. And we can just turn down the volume of that to about 30 or so. And that sounds like this. And then we can go over to the noise oscillator and just layer in just a little bit of white noise on top of everything. So go to the analog noise and go down to the JP106 high pass noise. Turn up the randomization just a little bit to about 26 and turn the level down to about 14. And that just adds just a little bit of noise on top of everything. And then we can go ahead and move over to our amplifier envelope. We'll leave these first two settings where they're at. Leave the decay where it's at as well. And the only thing that we really want to change is just bumping up the release to just about 471. So that way, whenever we release the key on our keyboard, we just get a little bit of a fade out. Then we want to move over to the filter and change it over to the 24 decibel filter. And this will be used to kind of cut out some of those upper high frequencies, but also to give it sort of that movement that you heard in the introduction. So route oscillator A and B, the noise oscillator, and the sub oscillator. We don't have anything on oscillator B for now, but this is just in case we want to layer things a little bit later. It's all routed up and ready to go. Let's go over to the cutoff, put that at just about 1300 or so. And then we want to go ahead and add in some modulation. So go over to the envelope number 2, add in some of that modulation. And we want to have this mod amount go up to 42. Make sure the resonance is set to 10. Boost the drive up to about 20 or so we get just a little bit more fatness out of it. And then we can go over to our filter envelope, which in this case is envelope number 2, and make some small adjustments. So the first of which will be going over to the attack and changing that to an amount of 19. So that way we have just a little bit of a fade in. Then you want to click on the decay and change that to 983. Then you want to change the sustain to an amount of 73%. And then you want to bump the release up to just over 1 second, so probably about 1.23. And that sounds like this. And then we want to add in some different effects to the synthesizer patch. So we'll go over to the effects section of the synthesizer, and then go over to the chorus, put the rate at 0.11. So just bump that up just a little bit. Take the delay number 1 and bring that down to just about 1.5. Take the delay 2 and put that just under the amount for delay number 1. Keep the depth all the way up. Bring the feedback all the way down. Low pass filter all the way up to let through all those high frequencies. And it sounds like this. So from there's a few last changes that we want to make. So let's go over to the global section and turn that down to 1 times draft. So this way it cuts out some of those upper high frequencies and gives us a slightly lower quality oscillator sound, which in this case will sound a little bit more smooth. Another weird thing here that's also worth noting is it takes that intensity of the pulse width modulation and really reduces it. Previously it had tons of vibrato and it sounded a little bit off and a little bit out of pitch. But because we turned down the oscillator's quality, it has less of that effect because that oscillator isn't quite as detailed and doesn't have quite as much harmonic depth to it, which is what was giving it that really intense vibrato effect. The last thing in the oscillator settings we want to do is go over to the tuning and just turn that down to 436. What this will do is slightly detune the synthesizer patch from its root note. So basically the whole synth patch will be slightly out of pitch. Now the amount of this will change based on the specific song project that you're working with. If you do a little bit too much of this, everything will sound out of tune, but just a little bit of this can model some of the pitch drifting and detuning that you have on vintage synthesizers that are older and their electrical components don't quite work as well as they used to. They tend to have a little bit of a pitch drift to them, which makes them go slightly out of tune, which can be a really cool sounding effect, especially in the digital realm when you're working on your projects, because everything will always be perfectly in tune, always perfectly in phase. But you can kind of add a little bit of that vintage flavor to everything, which can kind of spice up your tracks. But if it sounds a little bit too off for your specific song project, you could always do something like 139, so it's just a little bit out of tune. But for the specific patch, I like the sound of 436, so that's what I decided to go with. If you want less intensity on those modulations, you can always go into this section. So let's say you had too much phasing happening and you didn't like the way that that modulation sounded, you want a less intense effect. You could always go this output scaling and just turn this down, and that would turn down the intensity of that effect. So that's always an option depending on the overall sound that you're going for. The final thing you want to do is just bump up the voices to just about 12 or so that way you have a few more unison voices that can kind of ring out. So that way, if we have any notes that layer on top of one another, we can still hear them and they don't instantly cut off. Then we can close it out and add in one last effect, which in this case is going to be the soft tube saturation knob, which is a really great free saturation VST effect. It also comes in RTAS and AAX formats and AU as well. So it's definitely worth checking out and trying out the saturation plugin. I use it all the time on my tracks. Gives a really nice vintage sound to everything, and also just a little bit of a distortion to everything as well. And you can really use any saturation plugin you'd like. This is just a free one that I use quite often, and we'll put that at an amount of 2 on the saturation amount, and it'll kind of fatten up everything. Maybe turn that down just a little bit to about 1.6. That way we don't get too much distortion. Then I can go ahead and copy over the simple note pattern I had in the introduction, which just as a reminder, it sounded like this. So nothing too crazy going on with this note pattern. Basically, what I would recommend doing is starting off with really low notes on the synthesizer patch, which in this case was a G in the first octave. And then what sounds cool is when you jump from the bass notes to upper high frequency notes. So it could be something like that. The specific note pattern I have here doesn't matter too much, but what I have going on is just a G in the first octave, jumping up an octave to the second G, they're jumping up another octave as well to this G in the third octave, and then down to a D sharp in the third octave, and then to an A sharp, an F, D sharp, and A sharp again. So the main takeaway here is it sounds cool when you use this specific bass stab in the lower registers on the keyboard, and you can jump up to higher frequencies and then back down. It'll give you this really cool bass effect where you have these really fat low notes. Then you also kind of have a lead line that could sort of sit on top of everything as well.